Thank you all for coming, by the way. As I said, there's 28 people registered, and Diane at least found me. Thank you, Diane. Others may or may not join us. And I, it's the streaming software gives me no end of challenges, but um, we'll continue on. So today's topic is learning to see in black and white, and it's again, glad to see you. Um, and as I mentioned in the comments, this is being recorded, so I'll keep on going, and hopefully anybody who can't find us live will be able to watch it later. So there's going to be several aspects um, and to this, and we're going to start with talking about a histogram. And actually, before we get to that, even we should talk about digital sensors and camera sensors. We're going to leave out the Sigma cameras because they're a completely different sensor type. But pretty much all cameras today have CCD sensors. You don't have to know what that means, and I'm not going to go into it. But basically, a camera sensor is a bunch of really tiny solar panels. And we're talking on the level of microns. And a micron is a thousandth of a millimeter. So by default, every camera sensor is black and white. And all they record, each sense cell, what you think of as a pixel, each sense cell on the sensor is measuring the amount of light that reaches it and converting that to an electrical signal. And then from there it goes through an analog to digital controller and amplifier. Again, we're not going to go down that road. In order to get color, what they do is they put a series of color filters over top of each sensor. Most cameras use what's known as a Bayer array. So in groups of 4, you have 2 green, 2 red, and 1 blue filter. The reason for that is the human eye is more sensitive to green light than it is to red or blue light. But that goes back to the color talk, which was last week or 3 weeks ago or whenever that was. Whenever that was. There are 2 camera companies that make dedicated black and white cameras. If you want to get picky, they're called achromatic sensors, which is the same sensor but without the color filter array on top of it. It is possible, if you really want to make a color image using a black and white camera, like the Leica monochrome or the phase 1 achromatic, or the 2 cameras that have dedicated black and white sensors. If you want to make a color image, what you have to do is have a subject that has absolutely no movement, and you shoot the same scene 3 times, once with a red filter, once with a green filter, and once with a blue filter, and then you combine those 3 exposures in Photoshop and do some behind the scenes magic. But why you would take a dedicated black and white camera and try to make color images with it is beyond me. Anyway, so before we get talking into black and white conversion, we're going to talk about the histogram. And the histogram is probably the most important feature of your camera. Because that shows you what information the camera is captured. As I've said before, we look at a digital camera and we call it a camera. It's not. Basically, a digital camera is a computer with a lens stuck on the front of it. And all digital cameras shoot RAW files. Not all digital cameras give you access to the raw information. And the difference between a RAW file and a JPEG file is essentially is that a RAW file is not an image. A RAW file is a collection of information from which we can construct an image. Whereas hi Victoria, glad to see you. We're up to 9 people now, including me. So 10 people are finding their way in. You can back up and start over, or as I say, this is being recorded. So thank you all for finding me here. So yes, a RAW file is not a picture. A RAW file is a collection of information from which we can construct an image. And a JPEG is an example of an image constructed from the raw data. Um, RAW files are 16-bit, JPEG files are 8-bit. When you see the image on the back of your camera on the LCD screen, what you're seeing is the JPEG constructed from the raw data that the camera has collected. As I said a moment ago, all digital cameras shoot raw files, but not all digital cameras give you access to the raw information. Okay, so the histogram looks like this. Um, if you watch the color talk, you'll know that the digital cameras work with 3 different colors, red, green, and blue. It's called an additive color process. And so if you look at the histogram on your computer or on your camera, you should see 3 different basically lines. And what the histogram is showing you on the left over here is the darkest parts of your image. And over here on the right are the brightest or latest parts of your image. Okay. Anything that goes beyond the left side here is pure black. So there's absolutely no information there. And anything that goes beyond the right side here is pure white. So again, there's no information there. It's just blank. Okay. So this histogram, as you can see, has a pretty good collection of information. There's nothing pushing off the screen on either side. There's a fair amount of information captured here in the lower areas, which are the darker tones. And then there's another blip here in the lighter tones. Okay. So this is not the left side of your image and the right side of your image. This is the darkest parts of your image and the lightest parts of your image. And this is what the histogram is showing you in terms of the height is the amount of information in that capture from the scene. Okay, so if we overexposed our image, we'd have a lot more information over here, and if we underexposed our image, we'd have a lot more information over here. Okay, now we take this histogram and we're going to divide it up basically into 5 zones. But and within those 5 zones, we have a number of different tools that we're going to be able to manipulate this information. Now, these names may change a bit depending on the software you're using, and there are some programs that have some controls that other software doesn't have. We'll get into that a little bit later. But first, we're going to talk about the blacks. As you can see here on the left side of the screen, the blacks contain the lowest, say 5% of the darkest areas of your image. Okay, so if you're working with the black slider in your software, you're mostly manipulating this information right here. Okay, beside the blacks, we have the shadows. Okay, so the shadow slider over here controls about the bottom 25%, 25%. It probably varies a bit depending on the software. It includes the blacks. Okay. So if we're adjusting the shadows, we're mostly working with this information. We're not touching this information over here so much. We're mostly working with this information. Okay. Now on the other side of the histogram, we have the whites. And the whites, like the blacks, are the brightest parts of your image. So if we're adjusting the white slider or control in our software, again, we're working with about the top 4 or 5% of the brightest information in that image. And complementary to the shadows, we have the highlights. Now again, the highlights are about the top 20 to 25% of the brightest parts of the image. So if we're working with the highlights, we're mostly working with this information, not so much this information over here. Okay, between the highlights and the shadows, we have the midtones. So the midtones are the central portions of your histogram. Okay, so this information in the middle. And this is important, and we'll come back to this one in a bit. Now, the control we have over here at the top is the exposure slider. Okay, so if we increase exposure, basically what we're doing is we're taking all of this information and we're pushing it to the right. Okay, so anything that was dark is now less dark. It's becoming lighter. But anything that was here is now being pushed off the right edge of our histogram. Remember, anything that falls off the edge over here is gone. It's pure white. There's no way to deal with it. Okay. Um, if oops, sorry about that. Let me go back, see if I can fix that. There we go. Similarly, if we decreased exposure, we'd be pushing all this information to the left. So anything that was in here, again, would be pushed into pure black. So we can use exposure to make our image lighter or darker within reason, as long as we watch our edges. Okay. Now, there's one control in Capture One that's not in Lightroom. That's called brightness. And brightness is similar to exposure, except where exposure takes all of the information and shifts it to one side or the other side. What brightness does is it takes the information and it compresses it. Okay, so if we're increasing brightness or decreasing brightness, we're compressing the information. We're not just pushing everything to one side or the other. Okay. Again, that's a control that's in Capture One. It's not in Lightroom. We'll come back to this a little bit later. Now, contrast is the next slider. What contrast does is it starts in the midtones and it takes everything and stretches them apart. Okay, so if we think of my hands here as being the middle of the histogram, if we increase contrast, we're going to be stretching everything. So taking everything that's middle gray and pushing it out to the edges. Okay, so it's making the light parts lighter and the dark parts darker, and it's just stretching everything out. If we reduce contrast, then we're taking everything from the edges and pushing it in toward the middle. Okay, so again, you can see this result in our histogram. By decreasing contrast, we've taken all of the darkest parts of our image and we've squeezed them in. So there's no blacks anymore. There's no dark grays. There's no dark information. And there's no white information anymore. There's nothing really bright. We're just pushing everything in towards the grays. And if we increase contrast, then we're doing the opposite. Now here, so again, we're taking this information from the middle and we're stretching it out to both sides. Sorry about that. I was trying to get this to display full screen so that I wouldn't have this problem, and but that's what screwed up the streaming software. So we're going to have to live with this. So by increasing contrast, you can see we've clipped a little bit of the light information, but we've clipped a lot of the dark information over here. Okay. And then the last control here is clarity. Now clarity is like contrast, except it deals mostly with the midtones. You remember the midtones are the 50% of the histogram that's in the middle. So if we increase clarity, we're stretching out the contrast, but mostly in the middle area of the image. And if we decrease the clarity, we're pushing everything in towards the middle again, but again, mostly the midtones. We're not affecting the darker areas and the lighter areas too much. Okay, hope that makes sense to everybody, but that's the essence of what you're looking for when you're looking at your histogram. You know, in the film days, for example, if you were shooting slide film, it was common to underexpose a little bit, usually a stop or two, because by doing that with slide film, it brought out richer saturation and deeper colors. With your digital camera, you know, you want to look at what your histogram is showing you, because, as I've said before, when you capture a digital image, you're not taking a picture. You're collecting light information from which we can make a picture. While I'm here, You've probably heard the term ETTR, exposed to the right. And maybe you're wondering exactly what that means. What that means is when you're looking at your histogram, depending on the scene you're seeing, you should try to set up your exposure so that this part of your histogram gets as close to the right edge as possible without clipping. So if we go back over here to our, see, that's, here we've got clipped information on the right hand side. That's not good. If we go back over to here, you can see that in this case, we've got information almost to the right edge, but not clipping the edge. Now, it's a little hard to tell because for most cameras, what you're seeing in terms of histogram is the information from the JPEG generated from the raw file. Excuse me, there are a few cameras that will actually show you a histogram from the raw data, but not many of them. The reason behind ETTR is that if we were to take our histogram and divide it up into 8 equal columns, okay, from pure white over here to pure black, and if, remember, we're not capturing an image, we're capturing information. The way the sensor works is the sensor is much more sensitive and captures much more information in this right-hand side of the histogram than it does over here. Okay, so half of the total information, half of all the information in your raw file is from this 1/8 over here. Okay, 50% of what's left, so a quarter of your, yeah, a quarter of your histogram is from this area. Okay, so yeah. Diane is just saying there's a lot of opinions about ETTR, and I understand maximum shutter speed. So there's a trade-off. And people often say there's a trifecta of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. That's sort of true, but it's sort of not true because for any given amount of light coming into your camera, is affected in reaching the sensor. The amount of light reaching your sensor is affected by the shutter speed and the aperture. Okay, so the aperture is the lens opening, the size of the lens opening, and the shutter speed is how long your shutter is open and allowing light to reach the sensor. ISO happens after the fact, and ISO is an amplification of that signal, of that light. That's the computer processing behind the scenes. How well your particular camera responds to high ISO depends on the camera. Some of the more newer cameras from Nikon, Sony, etc., are considered ISO-less in that you can shoot up to, say, 3 or 4 stops underexposed and just increase the output in post-processing and see little to no effect. With other cameras, if you change your exposure value and you shoot, say, 2 or 3 stops underexposed rather than going to a high ISO, you can actually get more noise from your exposure compensation than you can from shooting at a higher ISO. Again, it depends on the camera. And, you know, in Diane's case, she's shooting wildlife, so she wants a high shutter speed. And having a high shutter speed means she has to adjust her ISO and or her f-stop. If you adjust your f-stop, then you're controlling your depth of field. So everything's about trade-offs. But that's a whole different discussion. So we're going to leave the histogram behind. And we're going to talk about shooting in black and white and learning to ski in black and white. Now, this is what you're seeing on your screen right now. This is an image made last fall in a place called Avatar Grove. It's up north of Port Renfrew on the southwest part of the island. This picture was made with a Leica 12mm lens. That's neither here nor there. But what I want you to look at right now is this is obviously a color image. And there's a lot of different colors in this image. There's a lot of yellows, greens, reds, there's some blue in the water. So this image is good because it's colorful. And there are some images, no, don't apologize, Diane. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Actually, the only stupid question is the unasked one. It's just everything is connected, and I can very easily get off on tangents and forget forget what I'm supposed to be talking about. Okay, so there are some images that are about color, where color is really the essence of why that photograph was made. And there are some photographers who make images that are primarily about color. Eric Miola is one. If you see a lot of Eric's images, color is the subject. Okay, and then there are other people like Mitch Dobrowner, for example. He shoots amazing grayscale images, mostly of storms and thunderstorms and a variety of things like that. And there are some people who are dedicated to shooting in grayscale. And they're very different worlds. What I wanted to talk to you about today is to emphasize that for most people, the best way to make a grayscale image is to shoot a color image and then convert it to black and white on your computer. Now, there are two ways to get a grayscale image. One is to shoot in JPEG and set the back of your camera to shoot in black and white. And actually, black and white is a bit of a misnomer. Grayscale is the correct term, but black and white shorter or more well known. So we'll stick with that one. But you can shoot in black and white on your camera, and you will get a black and white image, and you may be happy with that. But there's a disadvantage to that, which we'll cover in a minute. And the other way is to shoot in color on your camera and convert to black and white on your computer. And there, as I say, there are advantages to that. And one more thing before we get into looking at Lightroom, because we're going to start with Lightroom and then we'll jump to Capture One, and then if we have time, we'll move to some other software. You have three options. Again, depending on your camera, you can shoot RAW, you can shoot JPEG, or you can shoot RAW plus JPEG. Okay. Now, if you set your camera to shoot black and white and import them into your camera, import the RAW files into your camera, into your computer from your camera, they will be in color because the black and white processing on your camera only affects the JPEG file. It doesn't affect the RAW files. So RAW files will always be in color no matter what. Again, a RAW file is not a picture. It's not an image. It's just a collection of information that you can make an image from. Okay. So if you want to shoot RAW plus JPEG and shoot black and white JPEGs on your camera and have color RAW files to work with, that's fine. If, like me, if you just want to shoot RAW and then create JPEG, create black and white on your computer, that to me is the best way to go, but it's up to you. I'm not going to tell you how to work. It actually took me half an hour to try to figure out how to shoot black and white images on my camera, because why would I use it? Anyway, okay, so let's jump into Lightroom and just drag this over here so you can see it. There we go. Okay. Now we're going to start with this image, and we'll just bring this up. This was actually a black and white film image made with my Yashica Mat 124G. It's from a 120 film. So this is a rather low quality scan of a black and white film image. And it's this, I mean, it's, it's a bit of an oxymoron to say, but this is a color scan of a black and white image. So there is no color information in this image. So if we go here, just very quickly, we'll just straighten this up. And then we're going to just crop this down a bit. Apologies for all the dust spots on there. That's actually not, as you might have thought, from the scanner. This film was processed by a film lab on 4th Street that shall not be named, and they basically ruined my film, and I swore I would never go back and see them again. Okay, so before we get much farther, I wanted to show you. I talked about black and white versus grayscale, and this is basically what a black and white image looks like. It's either black or it's white. Okay, so now if we go back here to our linear gradient, this is grayscale. So we've got everything from black to white. Up here on the right, we have our histogram, and you can see there's a lot of light information. Now, as I go over the histogram, you can see this. Hopefully, you can see it on your screen. But if you have Lightroom, just move your mouse over the histogram, and you'll see it changed. Right now, it's showing the blacks, and the shadows, the midtones or the exposure, the highlights, and the whites. So from this histogram, you can see we have nothing blown out to pure white. This triangle here is telling me that I have a little bit of information that's clipped, and that's just from the bottom of the frame, um, the film frame. I could crop that off by going back here and just pulling that up a little bit more. There we go. And so it's still showing me that I have some black clipping, but it's not within the frame as we see it. Okay, so this is, as I say, a black and white image. This is the equivalent of shooting black and white JPEG on your phone or on your camera. And we have all of these basic sliders here: highlights, shadows, blacks, whites, exposure, and contrast. But because this is a black and white image, we have no color information. Okay, so we can set our black point, we can set our white point, we can adjust our shadows. I'm going to actually pull the whites down a little bit. I'm going to pull the contrast up some and pull the highlights down a little bit, and pull the shadows down a little bit. There we go. This was from Ross Bay Cemetery, and then we'll adjust the clarity a bit. Okay, so that's in essence a very quick edit of this image using just these sliders here. And if you shoot black and white JPEG, that's the limit. And we can get into doing curves and things, but that's basically the limit of what you can do. Okay, so we're going to leave that image behind, and we're going to go to something like this image. Okay, so this is an image made with a phone, Marcia's phone. I think Marcia's quite popular with shooting. She loves shooting flowers, and this is obviously still a JPEG, but this is a color JPEG, and we're going to make it into black and white. Now, in Lightroom, there are 3 ways to create a black and white image from a color image. The simplest one is to appear on where it says treatment, it says color or black and white. Okay, if we click on black and white, it converts it to black and white. We go back to color. Okay, the keyboard shortcut is V, as V as in Victor, not B as in Bravo. But if you press V on your keyboard, it'll convert it to black and white. So that's one way to do it, and it's a good method to use. Okay. The second method is down here under presence. I should mention to anybody who's wondering, this is Lightroom 6.14, so it's about 3 versions behind what the current Lightroom version is. And as such, I don't have access to all of the newest sliders and things that Lightroom has, but it's still useful enough for this subject. So here we have saturation, and if we take the saturation slider and slide it all the way to the left down to -100, we're down to a black and white image again. But if you look up here in the histogram, we've lost all of our color information. So taking the saturation slider and sliding it all the way to the left is essentially the same as shooting black and white JPEG in your camera. We don't want to do that. Okay, so let's put this back to 0. And the third option for converting to black and white is down here in your color panel. You have color, black and white, and HSL. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. If you watch the color talk, hue relates to color as you think of color. So red is a different hue than yellow, which is a different hue than green. Saturation refers to the amount of color, and luminance refers to how bright or how dark the color is. Okay, so if we go down here to the saturation slider and turn the saturation for all of these color channels down to 0, like so. I actually have a preset. You go over here to develop presets, take that off. Somewhere in here I have a black and white preset. Anyway, take my word for it. Now, you would think that doing this is the same as just turning the saturation slider down to 0, but it's actually not. Because we have color information, let's just reset these in this image. Come on now. Because we have color information in this file, and Lightroom is dealing with that color information, even if it's not showing it to you, then we can manipulate each color separately. Okay, and that's why it's, to me, important to shoot black and white images in color and then convert them on your computer, because by doing so, you have more information that you can work with than if you just shoot black and white. Again, if you shoot black and white JPEG on your camera, you have none of this color. It's just gone. All you have are grays. So let's take all these back down to 0 again. Okay. Now, up here, we talked about contrast, and we talked about highlights and shadows and whites and blacks, and the ways that these variables, so if we increase exposure, we can make this a little brighter. If we increase the contrast, we can start. And again, I'm going to take this extreme, but if you look at the histogram, you'll see how much it's squeezing together or it's separating apart. Okay. So we're going to increase the contrast just a little bit. Put that back to 0. Yeah, that's fine. Our black point is pretty much as far to the left as we want it to be. We can tone our whites down just a little bit. Okay. And now we've gone as far as we can with a grayscale image. But because we have color in this image, even if we're not seeing it, up here in your white balance slider, you've got temperature and tint. Temperature controls blue to yellow in terms of the color temperature of the light in which you shot, and tint controls green to magenta. But we can also use that to change our image by making it more blue or more yellow. We can accent different parts of it or make it stand out. If we shot this in black and white JPEG, moving these sliders wouldn't have much effect because it has no color information to work with. So now we've changed the contrast between the red, the pinks, and the greens just by moving the tint slider. Okay, so that's a minus 36. We put this back to 0, and then it's a subtle shift, but it's there. Okay, excuse me, I'm just going to have a quick drink here. Okay, now, similarly, down here we set our saturation for each one of these to 0, and saturation is the amount of color. Okay, so we have no amount of color showing, but the color information is still there. So if we go to our luminance slider, and remember, luminance is the brightness or darkness of any particular color. If we move the red slider to the right, there's a subtle shift. There's not a lot of red in this image, so we'll leave it at 0. But if we go down here to the green slider, for example, now by adjusting the green slider, we're making big changes. You see, because even though the greens aren't showing, Lightroom still has that information to play with. So let's set that about there. Now this part of the flower right here is mostly orange and yellow. So if we move that, we can make it darker, or we could make it lighter. I like it a little bit darker. And if the yellow part is here, so there's a fair bit of light, a fair bit of yellow in this flower. I don't think we need to go that far, but we could. So we're playing with contrast, but we're doing it using color information. Okay. So the aqua slider here mostly affects this bottom petal. I don't think we need to go all the way to 100, but again, we could tone that down just a little bit. The blue slider, move it back and forth. There's really no blue in this particular image. Okay, so we can leave that one at 0. Purples, again, this particular image not having much effect. And magenta, not really. Okay. I think this area up here on the top of the flower is a bit too bright, so I'm going to tone down the highlights just a little bit. And but that just shows you why you'd want to have color information, even if you're working with black and white. Okay, so let's reset all of these. Let's see here. Yeah, put all those back to 0, and we'll go back here, and we'll reset all of these. There we go. So we're back to our color image. Now, if we go back up here to the top of our panel and click on where it says black and white, okay, down here, instead of having HSL or color, we're now in the black and white panel. Okay, so these is basically doing the same thing. It's auto set this, and if we reset the black and white mix back to 0, we're in the same place that we were a minute ago. So we're basically adjusting the luminance of each one of these colors. Okay, this is a bit more extreme than we had then by turning the saturation down and just working with the luminance sliders. And you can, if you want to get really extreme, then by all means use the black and white conversion. If you'd like to be more subtle, then I would suggest that you do what I did and just convert all your saturation to 0 and use the luminance values to make things brighter or darker. Okay, so just get out of this just to show you. This is my completed edit of this image, there we go. Yeah, all right, we'll move on. So we're going to pick this image. Now, if anybody who's been downtown to the Inner Harbor should recognize this scene, you get the best clouds down in the Inner Harbor. And this is actually this is again made with a cell phone. It's a 3-shot HDR that was joined up in Lightroom. So the first thing we need to do is to just go here, and we're going to just straighten this a little bit. Maybe a little bit more, but that's close enough. I'm not going to waste a lot of time right now dealing with cropping and stuff. So again, if you look at, actually, forgive me, but crooked horizons bother me for some reason. So I'm just going to go down here to the rotate. There we go, and we'll set that about there. There we go. Okay, it's close enough. So looking at this scene, it's obviously very dark. We have a little bit of clipping in the clouds up in the top left. That's the red. And we have some clipping in the tree down in the bottom right. That's the blue. So the first thing we should do is bring this into balance. So if we hold down the shift key and double click on the black slider and then double click on the white slider, that brings most of our, you can also hold down the Alt or Option key, depending on whether you have Windows or Mac. Hold down the Alt or Option key and then move the black slider, and you can adjust it until you start to lose all of the. And same thing with the white slider. Hold down the Alt or Option key, and just drag it down. But holding down the Shift key and just double clicking on it on the slider gives you pretty much where you need to be. Okay, so by doing just those four, and we should maybe do contrast while we're at it. And actually, I think the contrast is fine. So now we've brought out a lot more detail on the trees here, and we've toned down this highlight up here. Add a little clarity, maybe. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing, and I'm going to go down here to saturation and just turn all these down. Should really go back and see if I can find that preset, because we're going to be doing this a lot of desaturate. There it is. Okay, so that's the preset I was talking about, and it basically all it does is turn all these saturation values to -100. So now we're going to go back to our luminance slider, and again, by moving the red slider, and I find it best to move them from all the way from one end to the other, and you can see that really the red slider is only affecting the Canadian flags and a little bit on this boat down here. But by turning the red slider all the way up, we lose our flags. They become just gray. So we're going to turn that down and hold that information. Orange is affecting the buildings a little bit and the clouds a little bit. I like the highlight that's bringing out in the cloud above the Delta Hotel, so I'm going to leave that about there. Yellow, that's not good. That's giving us an effect that we don't want. So let's pull the yellow up a little bit. Green is mostly affecting a bit in the clouds. So let's pull that up a little bit. Aqua seems to be bringing out some of the definition in the buildings. Blue is going to have the biggest effect because blue is most of our sky. So if we tone the blue slider down, then we start to make our image more dramatic. Okay. Purple affecting the clouds a little bit, and magenta is not, it's doing a little bit in the trees. So let's pull that up. Now, having reached that point, we can go back up, and now we can maybe increase the contrast a little bit, maybe increase the highlights a little bit. Not too far, we don't want to blow anything out. Too much, too much. Okay. Too far. There we go. So now we've made a fairly dramatic black and white image out of the color information that we had. Now, depending on how well versed you are in Lightroom, you may or may not know about the targeted adjustment tool, which is this little tool here. You have it in the tone curve, you have it in the HSL sliders, you have it in a couple of different places. And basically what that does, if you click on it, is it converts your mouse now into a little plus minus sign, okay? So there are very few sections in the average image that are a pure color, okay? As we saw moving the blue slider, turn that off for a second, moving the blue slider had a great effect on our clouds. But the aqua slider also had, wasn't the aqua, was it purple? Yeah. Aqua slider also had an effect on our clouds, okay? So, in the sky. So this color in the sky here is not just blue or not just purple. So let's reset these back to 0 for a minute and click our targeted adjustment tool. And by putting it over an area on the image and dragging it up or down, it's going to figure out what percentage of that spot is what color, and it's going to move them in relationship to each other. So let's say this is 80% blue and 20% purple. By dragging this down, you'll see over on the right in our luminous sliders that it's affecting both the blue and the purple. See? So now we've taken our targeted adjustment tool to bringing the blue all the way down to minus 100. And if we keep going, it takes the purple all the way down to minus 100. And similarly, if we go up, because there's more blue than purple in this image, if we keep going up, we can get them both to, but if we go down, it's going to, because there's a greater percentage of blue, okay? So if we were going to go down here to the trees, we're going to affect most of the oranges and the yellows, but it's also having an effect on the lower part of the sky, okay? So you can use the targeted adjustment tool on your image, and it will affect not just a color, but colors in relationship to each other. So it's a very handy tool to use. So let's close that one, go back here, and just to show you, this is how I processed this image. I probably, if looking back on it now, I would probably take this area here in the right-hand side of the darkest part of the tree and maybe lighten that up a bit. But I really wanted to bring out the drama in the sky because the clouds were just incredible that day. And this brings up another aspect of black and white photography, which is split toning. And again, in the film days, if you made a black and white print, then it was varying shades of gray. But you could, using a chemical process called sepia toning, for example, you could give your image an aged look, because a lot of older papers, the white parts tend to get more yellowy with time. And depending on the process, if you were using a platinum or a palladium process, they tended to have a bluish overtone to them. So if we go back here and go back to this, where we were with this image, and we go down a little bit farther, we have our split toning. Now, you'll see in split toning, you have highlights and you have shadows. Okay. In the middle of those is the balance slider. So the balance slider now is at 0, which means that the midpoint in terms of your histogram up here is at 50%. Okay, so anything brighter than 50% is in the highlights category, and anything darker than 50% is in the shadows category. You can move this slider up and down, and it will affect your final results. Okay, now for each of the highlights and the shadows, we have two sliders, hue and saturation. Okay, so again, hue is the color, what we think of as color, red, green, blue, whatever, and saturation is the amount of color. So by using split toning, we're basically adding an overlay to our black and white image. Okay. Now, if we move the saturation, the hue slider, you're thinking to yourself, nothing's happening. Okay. And the reason is because saturation is at 0. So it's adding an overlay, but it's adding a transparent overlay because you haven't given it any color to work with. The way around that is if we hold down the Alt key and move the hue slider, now it's showing us what it would look like if saturation was 100%. Okay, so let's pick a nice sepia color, somewhere maybe there. We let go of the Shift key. Our saturation's back down to 0, but now we can start to increase the saturation and add in a little bit of a sepia tone to our image. Okay, now this sepia, as you can see from the trees down here, is only affecting the brightest parts of the image. Okay, again, if we change the balance slider down, we could affect less. So now we've moved our midpoint all the way down to the bottom, so everything is shadows. Or if we move it the other way, we're moving our midpoint all the way to the right. And so now even these branches here are being affected by the highlights because they're now included in the highlights. Okay, so we'll put this back in the middle for now. If you want to get into duotoning, then we can set the shadows and the highlights different colors. So duotoning is usually, or often, not usually, but often kind of a yellow-blue combination. So again, we're going to hold down the Alt key, which shows us our hue as if it was at 100% saturation. And let's move it over here to the right. And we're going to let go. Then we're going to start to increase our saturation a little bit. So now we're still getting the yellowy brown color in the highlighted areas of the clouds, but we're starting to get some blue in the shadows of the clouds. Okay. Now these don't have to be different. Okay. If you want to tone your entire image, as I say, you can just take the balance slider and move it all the way one way or the other, and now your entire image has a sepia look to it. The other, so this is duotoning. Now the other thing you can do is if you click on this square, either one of them, you have the same thing in your brush tools, then you get this color box. Okay, so down here it's showing us the hue value, and over here it's showing us the saturation value. Okay, so if we click on, use our eyedropper tool and click anywhere in here, for example, or down here, we can pick a specific color. Okay, and use that for our highlights or our shadows. Okay. Now, there's an interesting feature of the color picker tool. And again, you have access to the color picker in the brush tools right here, as well as in your split tones. But if I take this out of full screen for a second, and we're just going to collapse this over a little bit so we can see our background. Okay, so let's say we're in our select color picker box for the highlights, and we're looking for a color to make the highlights. And we're thinking to ourselves, you know what? We had that image that we made in Avatar Grove, and the reddish, pale red color from the wood chips was just perfect. I wonder if I could use that for my highlight slider. Well, actually you can. What you do is you put your eyedropper tool inside the box, okay? Click the mouse and hold it down, and then take the mouse and drag it outside of that color box. So if we go into our image, we can pick a color from the image. But if we go outside the image, we can go over here to that red chip on the ground in Avatar Grove and pick that color. And so you can see right here where it says current color, that's the color sample that it got from the screen. You can pick anywhere on your screen that is visible to the eyedropper tool. Okay, and I'll show you another use for that, but it's just, so just click on put the eyedropper tool inside the box, click, hold down the mouse button, and then just slide it anywhere you want. And you'll see over here on the current color box that wherever I slide on my image, it's going to pick up that color. Okay, so let's go back to our wood chips. And there we go. So we'll close that. And then that's now our highlight color. Okay. And this isn't actually part of the black and white talk, but just since we're, as I said to Diane, it's easy for me to get distracted. And since we're talking about the color picker tool, let me just get out of here for a second. We'll go back over here to this image. And if you're in your brush tool, for example, and you want to pick a color, again, you click on click on your eyedropper, go over to your image, and you can select anywhere within your image, and it'll add that to your color box. Or, as I demonstrated earlier, you can go anywhere outside of Lightroom, anywhere on your screen that's visible. And that's now, this area of the flower here is now in the color picker. And what you could do with this, since we're here anyway, is we take our brush tool and we crank saturation all the way down to 0, okay? And click on our leaves here. Now what it's doing is it's taking the green from these leaves and changing them to gray. But instead of gray, it's adding the orangey color from our color box. Okay, so just going to undo that. And we'll get back out of this and get back to talking about black and white. Okay, so that's, I'm not going to bother to get into to that. This is some mushrooms, again, made with a cell phone. That's the black and white, that's the color. One of the features of black and white, as I mentioned in the beginning, is that when you remove color, you strip an image down to its bones. all you're left with is composition, structure, tone, contrast, um, and texture. And so if you have an image, a color image, and you're not sure, is this image of any use? One of the quickest ways to do it, if you're in Lightroom, for example, is to tap the V key. And that takes away all the color, and you're looking at the skeleton, if you will, of your image. If it looks good in black and white, then it's probably worth continuing. If it doesn't look good in black and white, then you have to consider, is this image worth keeping? Unless, as I said at the beginning, the image is about color, in which case converting it to black and white is not going to get you very far. And just, I wanted to show you one more image here. This is an image that was made, again, one of Marcia's images. And this is a close-up image of some tree bark. And you're thinking to yourself, why would anybody shoot an image of tree bark? Well, it's, it's rather interesting. I mean, compositionally, it doesn't look like much to start with, but if you look at the texture in the bark, there are, excuse me, there are some amazing textures there. So what can we do with this? Well, let's start by doing this. Push the clarity a little bit. There we go. Okay. And now we're going to use our desaturate preset. So now we've converted this to black and white, and it's still, you're thinking to yourself, okay, this isn't this isn't exciting me too much, but let's see what we can do. Not much red in this image, so it doesn't matter. We'll leave that one where it belongs. A little bit of orange. Let's crank down the orange slider. There's some yellow. So we'll move yellow around a little bit, not too dark. A little bit of green, so let's increase the greens a bit. By the way, you'd be surprised if you start playing around with colors in Lightroom or any other software. Things that we think of as green are mostly yellow. It's interesting. Our eyes are very sensitive to green light, but the actual color temperature or color information is quite different. Okay, so that's not too much there. Blue. Yeah, blue's having a bit of an effect. I'm still not winning you over with this image, I can tell, but that's okay. Just bear with me. Okay, so that gets us to this point, and it's still, Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our tone curve, and you can see the histogram on your tone curve. And this isn't really a talk about tone curves, but basically, like your histogram, on a tone curve, the left side of your curve is black, and the right side of the curve is white, okay? And the top is the amount of information, and the bottom is the, so if we were to take the blacks, didn't want to do that. If we were to take our black point, which is this bottom left corner here, and slide it all the way up, we've now removed all of the black from our image, okay? So it's taking, you'll see on the right here, it says 0, 0, and then 40. Let's get back there. It says 0, 0 on the left, and then 40% on the right. So what we've done is taken anything that was 0, pure black, and we've changed it to 40% gray. Okay. So we talked earlier about contrast, and if we move this up to, say, 50, 49.8, that's about as close as we can get. And now if we take our white point, and our whites are showing 100, and we move our whites down to 50, Okay, we've basically removed all of the contrast. And if you look at the histogram up here, all we have left is pure middle gray. Okay, so when you work with the tone curve, there we go. Put this back down where it was. When you work with the tone curve, if you pick a point in the line, say here, okay, so that's 75% lightness. If we move it up, it's making that part of the curve lighter. If we move it down, it's making that part of the curve darker. Now it's also moving, because we only have one point on this curve, it's also making everything else lighter or darker. Okay, so if we go back to our linear, so the straight line means that nothing has been altered. Instead, we start adding points to the curve, right? That, for example. Now, if we move this point up, it's only affecting the brightest areas because these points are preventing it from affecting anything else. If we move this point down, we're starting to create what's known as an S curve because it has a vaguely S shape, okay? If we move the point to the left or to the right, then we're affecting lighter or darker areas, okay? So if we move this way, you can see that we're starting to stretch out the top part of the curve and is pure white, and that's, of no use to us. So that's the 30-second introduction to the tone curve. And now, by increasing the contrast in this image, we're starting to get less an image of tree bark and more into an abstract image. So what we're going to do here instead is we're going to go back to our linear curve. We're going to take the black point and we're going to drag it all the way up to the top. And we're going to take our white point and drag it all the way down to the bottom. And now essentially what we have is a negative tone curve, or in film terms, we've got a negative image. It doesn't look like tree bark anymore, does it? It looks much more like, I don't know, rock or just an abstract image. We can play with the contrast a bit. Now, because we've got a negative tone curve, it's important to remember that everything we do is going to be backwards. So if we increase the whites, we're increasing the white information, but we're actually making those parts of the image darker because we have a negative tone curve. If we decrease the blacks, we're making the darkest parts of the image lighter. So it's a little bit not what you'd expect. Same thing with the shadows and the highlights. If we increase the shadows, we make it darker. If we decrease the highlights, we make it brighter. And now we have a completely non-representational image, what some people might call an abstract. And I think it's moderately interesting, considering where we started. That's just another example of the way you can deal with black and white. And I think that's all we're going to deal with in terms of Lightroom. Again, this is the way I processed that image originally. And I think it makes an interesting pattern. Nobody looking at that is going to think that's a close-up of a tree. What they do think it is, well, that's entirely different. And again, if you wanted to, you could add some split toning values to it. Okay, so that's enough about Lightroom. And we're going to jump over to Capture One. Oh, I forgot. I'm going to jump back into Lightroom for a minute. One thing that's very important. I mentioned earlier that if you, in your camera, You can shoot JPEG, you can shoot RAW, or you can shoot RAW plus JPEG. Okay. And I also mentioned that the image that you see on the LCD screen on the back of your camera as a JPEG that the camera has generated from the raw data. Okay. Now, if you shoot RAW plus JPEG and import them into Lightroom, by default, Lightroom will ignore the JPEG files. Okay. All of these images that you're seeing on my screen here, if these were RAW files, they're not, but if they were, these would be JPEGs that Lightroom has generated. And even these, though these are JPEG images, what you're seeing are JPEGs that Lightroom has generated for its own purposes. Okay, so if you import a RAW file and a JPEG file, let's say this one was a RAW file of the color image and the black and white one was a JPEG file. If you imported them both into Lightroom, by default, Lightroom would hide the JPEG file. You wouldn't see it. If you want to have both the RAW file and the JPEG file in Lightroom, you go to Edit, go down here to Preferences. Actually, I think in Mac it's a little bit different. It's not under Edit. I think it's under Library. Doesn't matter. But you go to your Preferences, and let's drag the Preferences dialog box over here so you can see it. Go to the General tab, and down here, there's a box that says Treat JPEG files next to RAW files as separate photos. That's turned off by default. If you turn that on, now if you import a RAW file and a JPEG file, it will import them both and treat them as separate images. Okay, so if you shoot RAW plus JPEG and you got black and white JPEGs in your camera and you import them into Lightroom, and all you see are color images, and you're going, what the hell happened to my black and white images? That's probably it right there. Okay, so like as I say, I don't shoot JPEGs. I don't shoot RAW plus JPEG. I either shoot RAW or with my phone. But that's what you want to look for. Okay, let's close out of Lightroom, and then we're going to drag Capture One over here. There we go. And let me just go to Mix Workspace. There we go. Good. So this was the background image that I showed you earlier. It's the one on my desktop. And I like to think it's a nice image. Some people may or may not like it. But if you look at it, again, there's a lot of different colors here. There's a lot of subtle shifts in the yellows and the greens especially, but there's some reds in the tree trunks and along the forest floor. There's a bit of blue. So there's actually a lot of different colors in this image. Okay. Now, if I take this image and convert it to black and white, it looks like that by default. Okay. We could stress out or stretch out the colors the way we did in Lightroom. But what I wanted to highlight here is I talked about black and white stripping your image down to the bones. I think this image is still reasonably interesting for a color image, but I don't know that it has a lot of information, a lot of use as a black and white image. It's too busy. There's too much competing for the eye. Okay, and so that's one of the things to look for if you're looking at making black and white images, is you want to simplify your compositions when you can. Because even though you may have red and green and blue, etc., in your image, if you look at them all in grayscale, so if you have a medium red and a medium green and a medium blue, they're all going to be the same color of gray. You can, as I showed, manipulate them, make the reds darker, make the blues lighter, or whatever. But generally speaking, when you're shooting in black and white, and when you're looking to shoot in black and white, the basis of this talk is supposed to be about how to think in black and white. You want to look at the lightness and darkness of each aspect of your image, and you want to ask yourself, how cluttered this image is. Okay, so I think this image in color is a nice shot. I like it. I like it enough to have it on my desktop background. But I think as a black and white image, it doesn't do a whole lot. Okay. Now some color images. Let's just slide down here. Some color images don't have a whole lot of color to start with. So this is a color image, and you can see it's got a bit of yellow in the sky and a bit of blue in the water, but there's just not a lot of color. So the focus, if you will, if you'll forgive the pun, the focus of this image is more on the separation between the dark of the water, the clouds, the lighthouse here, and things like that. So we can take this image and we can begin to work with it. And if we take, this is the levels tool, and much like the curves tool, where in the curves tool in Lightroom, excuse me, if I can bring up the curves tool here, but much like the curves tool in Lightroom, where this is your whites and this is your blacks, by moving this white point to the left, I'm basically I'm saying that anything now from this point, which is 149 out of 255, or 256, so almost the middle gray and above is going to be pure white. Okay. Now there's very little, some of the highlights in the waves, some highlights in the sky out there, but if you look at the histogram down here, there's very little information that's pure white. Let's move this back over here. The levels tool in Capture One does basically the same thing. So we have our input values up here, 0 being black and 255 being white, and our output values down here. So right now, they're the same. If I take this whites slider and move it over to the right, what I'm saying to Capture One is take anything 160, or take anything 255, no, take anything 168 and higher and make it 255. So I'm making anything in here pure white, but because there's no information here, it has the effect of brightening up the image. Now, if I take it too far, you can see I'm starting to lose a lot of color information, especially in the sky. Okay, so let's leave it somewhere around there. We have the same thing on the left-hand side, where this point up here is a 0, which is pure black. And if you look down here on our histogram, there's an area here that has no information. So if we take our black slider and move it a little bit to the right, it has the effect of making anything darker. Now, if I move it over too far, again, we're changing all of that into pure black. But we can get to that point where we've increased the contrast without introducing too much pure black or too much pure white. So we just take out that little bit up there. Now this slider, this is the midpoint, if you will. If we move this to the right, we make the scene darker. And if we move this to the left, we make the scene overall lighter. Okay, just going to reset that. Okay, so that's our levels tool. Lightroom doesn't have a levels tool. Photoshop does, Affinity Photo does, and various things like that there. Let's bring our histogram up so you can see it. Okay, so I mentioned in Capture One they have a brightness slider and an exposure slider, and then again, the exposure slider moves the entire histogram to the right or to the left, but the brightness slider compresses it. So if I move the brightness slider to the right, I'm starting to squeeze information over into the blacks, and that's not really helping us. That's not the tool we want here. What we want to do is we want to take these brighter areas that are still showing red, and we want it to tone them down. So for that, we're going to use the highlight slider. It may not give us much effect in this point because this image, those areas just have no data. It was just too much contrast for my camera to handle. So we're just going to take that back off. We can deal with this, but we'll have to do it differently. Another thing that Capture One has that I don't think Lightroom has is layers. So if we go here and we create a new filled layer, and we're going to call this whites, turn the mask on. So the mask is now covering the entire area. But up here we have something called Luma range. And if we click on that, drag this over here so you can see it. Okay. This is very similar to our levels tool. And if we turn on, we're showing the mask. So what we want to do is we want to affect all of the brightest areas, but we're going to take this and we're going to start to move it to the right. And as we move it to the right, we're removing parts of the darker images, the darker parts of the image from our mask. So we're no longer selecting anything except these brightest points. Okay. So let me just click apply. And if we go Alt M, so now it's showing you anything that's black is not being affected by the mask, and anything that's white is being affected by the mask. Okay. If we go back to our Luma range, right now we have a very hard mask, so it's either on or off. Okay. But if we adjust the radius up a bit and start to adjust the sensitivity, it has the effect of blurring our mask a little bit. Okay. Because we don't want a hard transition. So now we're going to click apply, and we're going to turn the mask off. Turn the mask on, off. There we go. So now, because we're working on just our whites, if we take our exposure and turn it down just a tad, we can take it way down so you can see the effect, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to pull our whites down just enough so that they're not too harsh. Okay. And now we've softened that look a little bit. I have to do this. It's driving me nuts. Hang on a second. There. I don't like crooked horizons when they have no reason to be there. It's a personal thing. Just, oops. Close enough. Okay. So now we've got an image here. Now we could, if we wanted to, you can see the light beams coming down from the sky here. We could create another layer, and we'll call this light beams. And we'll fill the mask. And we'll go back to our Luma range. And this time we're going to pull this down so that we're not affecting, turn the mask on so we can see it. And we're going to bring this up. Oh, display mask, come on. There we go. We're going to pull this up so that we're only dealing with those lighter parts of the sky. Let's move this down here so you can see better. Move this a bit to the right. Move this up a bit. So now we're affecting all of the area up here in the sky, we're also affecting the water. We don't want to affect the water, but we'll come back to that. Um, so click apply on that. And now we're going to increase our light beams in the sky. Okay, too much maybe about there. Now this is having the effect of also re-brightening the area of the water that we just masked out. So if we hit M again, you can see that we're doing all that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go here and we're going to go clear mask. So now we've made an adjustment. We've increased the exposure by 1/3 of a stop, but it's not affecting any part of the image. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to take our brush tool. I'm going to go up here, click, hold down the shift key, click, down to here, click, over to here, click, up here, click, and then we're going to go over here. We're going to right click on that, and we're going to say fill mask. So now our 30% or 1/3 of a stop increase in exposure is only affecting the sky. We've toned down the lights in the water, but we can have the effect of increasing. Let's turn the mask off so you can see. Now we can increase our exposure in the sky without affecting the water at all. Okay, so let's make it back about there. Okay, so this is supposed to be a little black and white, and it is, because to me, if you shoot in color, and I believe you should, and this is a raw file, if you shoot in color, then you should sorry, that had effect I didn't want it to have. Because I created a new mask, it took away my Luma range mask, so that's okay. We're just going to, because I was wondering why it was affecting the boy when it wasn't supposed to be. And there we go, that's about back to where we were. So now we've recreated our Luma range mask, and so now if we adjust exposure, it's no longer making our half of our boy lighter and half of our boy darker. That's not what we wanted. So let's push this back up about 1/3 of a stop. Okay, so as I was saying, this is a raw file, and to me, if you're going to make a black and white image, you should do as much processing in color as you can and then move on from there. So like with Lightroom, there's a saturation slider, and if we slide the saturation slider all the way to the right, we remove, except in doing that, we're only affecting that area because we're on the wrong level, on the wrong layer. So let's go back to our background layer. See, you watch this in real time, you get to see all the mistakes I make. So now, as I said, I could take the saturation slider and drag the saturation all the way down to 0. But if we do that, it's the same as shooting black and white JPEG in the camera. We've now removed all of the color information from this file, and that's not a good thing to do. So instead, in Capture One, as in Lightroom, there's a black and white toolbar or tool V on the keyboard in Lightroom. There's no dedicated keyboard shortcut in Capture One, which is too bad. But again, we have the same sliders. We can, again, there's a little bit of red in this image, but not a whole lot. So we're going to ignore that one. There's yellow in the sky. So if we increase the yellow, we can make the sky a little bit brighter. Not a lot of green. Some cyan in the water, so we can use that to bring out some of the highlights in the water. Most of the water is blue, so we can bring that out a little bit. Actually, I might make that a bit darker. Okay. and then magenta, again, is not doing much. Okay. Now, Capture One has amazing color abilities, and so, like in Lightroom, we have the same channels here. So if I click, the blue slider here, for example, and adjust the luminance of the blue, then it's the same as adjusting the luminance in Lightroom. Okay, we're making the blue darker. Okay, we can adjust the saturation, but that's because we're working in black and white, and by changing the hue, we're also changing it a little bit because we're changing it from blue to magenta or from blue to cyan. So you have the individual color channels just the way you have in Lightroom. Over here on the right is this multicolored one, and this one here has the same effect as the targeted adjustment tool in Lightroom. So again, we click on this direct color editor, and we'll click up here in the sky. Okay, and now it's picked that color, which is not quite yellow and not quite orange. But again, if we adjust this, we're only adjusting that particular selection of colors. Okay. I'm going to leave the color editor alone for a second. I'm going to go back to color. Just turn this off for a second because I want to show you the advanced color editor in Capture One. And if you saw my Capture One talk, you will have seen this before. But the advanced color editor in Capture One is something that Lightroom simply doesn't have. So if we click this area here, for example, in the waves, now you're seeing a color wheel. That little blue dot right there is the exact color that I selected. Okay. You can see it's a bit fuzzy around the triangle. That's basically the what's the word I'm looking for? I can never remember that word. Feather. That's the feather of that color. So I can make that specific and have only that exact color, or I can make it a little bit more general and fan out, start to literally to feather out from that color a bit more, like so. Okay. So let's put that back down to 0. Now, if I drag this way, I can affect the range of tones, the saturation levels. So that hue, that dot in the middle is that hue of blue. And actually, down here it says view selected color range. So if I turn that on, it looks like it's mostly black and white because it's only showing you the limited range of blue tones in color. If I drag that out, you're starting to see a bit more blue. I don't know if you can see this on your screen. If I drag this to the right, now it's including more into the greens, and now it's including more into the magentas. So all this area up here, which is mostly yellows and oranges, is not being affected, but it's affecting all of the blue tones in the water. If I was to pick an area up here, say this part of the cloud, now on the bottom here you can see the yellows, and so it's not affecting any of the blues in the water. And again, I can choose how specific a yellow I want to affect. This is mostly a black and white tone image, or a two-tone image anyway. I'd probably be better off. Let me just leave that one where it is for a minute. We'll go over to this one. This image has a lot of different yellows and greens. And so if I click this yellow leaf down here, so that's showing you this yellow is affecting a little bit of the green in the leaves. It's affecting these yellow leaves back here and a little bit in the trunk. If I increase the saturation. It includes more. If I start to push this wider, then it's including more of the colors in the trunk. And now we're including more of the greens. Okay. If I get very specific, then we start to lose all of the greens. And if I pull this down, then we start to lose even more. And I can remove the least saturated. And now we've only affecting these yellows and these yellows down here. Okay. Now, hopefully you've reached this point in the talk and realized if this was a black and white image and we were adjusting the lightness or the luminance value of these yellows, okay, we'd only be affecting that part of the image. Okay, so you have, even in black and white, and if we go back here and convert this image to black and white, then go back here and turn that off. If we change the luminance value, we're only affecting those specific parts of the image. So you have much greater ability to make finite changes to your luminance values in Capture One, even though you're looking at a black and white image. Okay, so if I take this bark here, for example, which is mostly dark brown, and I start to change the luminance, then I'm affecting that tree. I can add, and again, I can choose how much of the tree I want to affect. I can make, I can include some of the yellows as well, and now I'm affecting more area or less area. Okay, so these are two. Capture One has a most incredible color tool, even if you're working with black and white images, as long as you don't remove all the color information by either shooting black and white JPEG or by removing all the saturation by desaturating the here, the saturation slider. Okay, so we're going to jump back over to this image for a minute. And so we're still working in color. So let's go back here down to our black and white tool. Okay, so now we've got a black and white image. It's got a fair good contrast, and we can use either these sliders, color balance right now, these sliders, or with the advanced color tool, we can pick very specific tones to work on. Now, because Capture One has layers, if we wanted to do split toning like we did in Lightroom, there is a split tone slider, and we have highlights and we have shadows. Okay, so we can crank up the hue. Again, saturation's at 0, so it's not showing us anything. Unfortunately, the Alt key doesn't work the same way in Capture One that it works in Lightroom, but you can crank saturation all the way up to 100, pick your color, and then crank the saturation back down again. Okay, same thing with the shadows. We can do that, and we can do that, let's crank that down. It's a bit too purple. More like that. So now we've almost recreated our color image, but in a duotone. If we turn these back down to 0, one of the other features we have in Capture One with the color editor, if we go back to this blue color, for example, which is this area of the water, we can also go up here to these 3 dots beside the color editor and click on it and say create masked layer from selection. So if we do that, it's now creating a mask only selecting the blues. So we go back to our layers, and we're going to call this one blues. Okay, if I turn the mask on, oh, okay, why are you not working? Um, that's unusual. Let me just, the wonders of live editing. That's interesting. It should work. Well, maybe not, because it's in black and white. Okay, hang on a second. Let's try this again. I'll delete this layer and delete that layer. I'll go back to the background layer back here, turn black and white off. Back to our color editor and show. So now it's showing us the blues. So now, because we have color, it should create a mask. There we go. So that's showing us the areas that it's affecting. So let's go back and enable black and white. So we've still got our mask. And now if we wanted to use our split tones, turn the mask off because we don't need to see it right now. We could create a color in just the blues. No, it's not. That's interesting. It's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. Oh, yeah. Anyway, that's not what I wanted it to do, so we'll come back to that. I'm just going to abandon that as a bad effort for now. It should have just affected this part of the mask. You have to do, yeah. Anyway, so that's good enough for now. It's not doing what I expected it to, but that's the power of live radio. This is just to show you. This is how I finished processing this image, um, and okay. So one last one. This is an image made China Beach, maybe somewhere in Juan de Fuca Provincial Park. And again, this is a raw file, a GNG file, made from a panorama. I can't remember, 3 or 4 images. As a color image, not too exciting. But what we're going to do is we're going to right click on it, and we're going to edit with, and we're going to go to Silver Effects Pro 2. Now, Silver Effects Pro was originally made by a company called Nik Software, N-I-K, and then Google bought out Nik Software and made the suite of software free. And then DxO bought the Nik Software suite from Google, and they revamped it, and they now sell the updated version of software. It's just taking a long time because it's A, the image is on an external hard drive, and B, I got a bunch of other software running. So let's close that, and maybe I should pick a different image instead, or maybe, oh, there we go. Okay, it's coming up now. So you can buy the DxO version of the Nik, what's called the Nik suite, and I'm sure they'd be very happy if you did. you can still find the older free version of the Nix suite. It includes HDR FX Pro, Silver FX Pro, Color FX Pro, and um, some other in the package. And Silver FX Pro is a black and white conversion software. So if you have Lightroom or Photoshop or Affinity Photo or Capture One or whatever, you can load Silver FX Pro as a plugin to those programs, or you can use it as a standalone program. Now, Silver FX Pro will not work with RAW files. It will work with JPEG files or with TIFF files. So let's just let this load. We got 3 minutes before Marcia comes and bangs on the door. Oh well, it's not my fault. We got started late because the streaming software wasn't working. So that's just the way it is. This might take too long. Let's just go to File, go to Open Image, and let's see here. SPC, Pictures, these pictures. 20. Okay. Not going to find many JPEG files. Let's pick this one to work on instead. Just going to close out of Capture One, free up some memory. There we go. That's fine. Oops. Okay, Silver FX. Because I closed Capture One, Silver FX closed as well. It's just one of those days. Okay, let's go back here to. I should have it in here and I don't see it. Okay, no problem. We can fix that. This PC. Program. C. Program files. TXO. The collection. Solar FX Pro 2. Bring that up. Okay, let's try once more with feeling. Open image. Let's pick this one. Okay, there we go. So this is a black and white image of the harbor, obviously. In Silver FX Pro, we have a full screen. We have a split screen before and after, and a side-by-side preview. There are a number of different presets that you can work with. Again, this is the older version of Silver FX Pro. I haven't seen or worked with the newer version, but these are just some of the presets that you can play with. But if you don't like presets, and I don't, then we'll just go back to neutral. So this is where we started. Over here on the right, we have a number of adjustments. Now again, we have global adjustments for brightness, so we can make it brighter. or darker. We can increase contrast, and we have structure. Now structure, it's hard to describe structure. It's basically like micro contrast, so it's looking for edges and it's increasing the contrast along those edges. Underneath the global adjustments, where we minimize that tab, oh no, it's still there, we have tonality protection. So the tonality protection is designed to keep things from blowing out to pure black or pure white. So if we increase the shadows, it's going to take anything that's pure black and make it a bit lighter. And if we take the highlights and increase that, it's going to take anything that's pure white and make it a bit darker. Okay. One of the features, that's the global adjustment, so we're just going to minimize that. One of the features of Silver Efex Pro is that it has what's called selective adjustments. Now, if we click on that where it says control points and go into our image, it's hard to see. If I put my mouse over that dark part of the ship, you can see there's a little circle there. Okay, so if I click on that, it creates a control point. And we have a number of sliders. So this top one shows how much of the area I want to work with. Okay, by dragging the slider left and right, I'm affecting more or less area. Okay, and then I can adjust the brightness or the contrast or the structure, et cetera, within that area. Now, because this control point is on a dark part of the ship, even if I adjust the brightness, even though it's encompassing almost, oh, here, we'll make it really big. That's as big as it can get. Because my control point's on a dark area, let's move it over to a really dark area here. There we go. So even though this control point is covering almost the entire image, because it's centered on a dark spot, by changing the brightness level, it's not going to affect the brightest parts of the scene. So if I can take that all the way down, you can see that it's only affecting the darker parts. Okay, so you take the brightness down a little bit. Contrast is fine. Again, structure is like micro contrast, so it's adjusting edges. We can amplify the whites. So we're looking at the lightest areas affected within that dark zone. We can amplify the blacks, so that's looking for the darkest areas within that zone. Okay. We can fine structure is really, really fine gradations, so we can make it bring out structure or we need to, and then we've got selective colorization, so we can add color to just the darker parts of the scene, or we can take color away from darker parts of the scene. Now, I don't know if you can see on your screen, but at the bottom here, there's a little arrow. If we push that up, the brightness, contrast, and structure are the default sliders shown. If you click the down arrow, then you get all of them. Okay. So now if we zoom in here, I'm currently at 100%, we'll zoom into 100%. And let's just move this around. Okay, so it's, yeah, this is the Sea Shepherd ship. Let's move into 200%, just so you can get really close here. This image is not very high resolution, but again, we'll go back to our control points, and we'll add a control point on this trident here. Okay, so now by adjusting the fine structure, you should see that it's bringing out detail along the edges, like the wires and along here. Too much will make it look horrible. So you have to use these things with some finesse. If this was a higher resolution image, then it would be you'd be able to see much more information. So that's that. So that's selective, and we can have as many control points as we want. We can click on the control point again, and we can add one here. And now this is affecting, say, only a small area of the image, but you get the idea of how it works. The color filters apply. Let me go back out to full screen. There we go. The color filters um, affect the details. So again, we're changing the hue of the reds. If we click on the blues, and we're changing. So now we're having the effect of increasing or decreasing the contrast, mostly in the blues, and we can vary how much effect that's having by making the blues much darker or much lighter. Okay. Um, you've also got a number of film presets. So if you used to shoot film, there are a number of every film that you shot had its own look. And people who shot a lot of black and white film knew what kind of images that particular film was going to generate. Okay, so you can mimic that by picking a specific film type. Okay, let me get out of that. And then within that, if we pick, well, I like Ilford HP 400, for example. Um, we're now working excuse me, with an emulation of an Ilford HP 400, but we can still add grain or remove grain if we add a little bit of grain. And again, you're going to need to see it bigger. So now if you look here, you can see that we've added grain to the image, or we can remove grain from the image. We can make that grain really granular. We can soften it. We have levels and curves, which we've talked about already. So these are your curves. Sensitivity is again your color sliders, so we can affect just one color or all of them. And finally down here, we have finishing adjustments. So these are your split toning sliders, okay? And if we pick this one, for example, and let me just zoom back out again, get rid of levels and curves because we don't need that right now. Let's turn the green down because we don't need that right now. Okay, so we have a number of built-in color filters. We can also click on one and we can adjust it. We can adjust the vignette off or on. So if we turn it on, we have lens fall off, make it darker. We can make it lighter, and things like that. We have burn edges, so we can pick any one or all four edges, and we can burn in like that, and like that, and like that. I'm trying to go through this very quickly, but just to give you an idea of what it's capable of. And then the final one, which is kind of nice, is that it has built-in frames. So we have a basic white frame with a bit of black, you know, a thicker black, more of an uneven edge. And then again, even within these, we can decide if we want our frame to be thicker or thinner. And we can choose the spread value. Uh, it's taking a while to run this, but and then we can change the pattern. That just gives you a quick idea. Down here we have our histogram and our loop. This is the histogram here, and you can see, what we've done with it. So let's go back here. This is that was our initial image with the control points. And so Silver Effects Pro, as I say, you can buy the version from DxO, and they'd be quite happy if you did. You can also find the older free version available online, and that's about it. I was going to talk a bit about SNS HDR, but I'm not going to get into that tonight because it's already 8:45. You folks have been more than patient with me, and so I'm going to close that out. So learning to see in black and white means looking at not just the colors of what the scene is, but how bright or dark the different elements of the frame are. You want to try to find simpler compositions, anything that has textures or structures, shadow, highlight, detail, changes in contrast, things like that. Anything that will accent the skeleton or the bones of your image, if you will. It takes a while to learn how to develop an eye, but fortunately, if you're working in Lightroom or you're working in Capture One, for example, or something similar, even Snapseed, if you're working on a phone, by shooting in color and then doing your process in black and white on the computer, you end up with much more to play with than if you just shoot a black and white JPEG. If all you have is a black and white JPEG or a scan of a black and white negative, then you can still play with contrast. You can still play with the white point, the black point, the highlights, the shadows, the midtones, but you can't create separation in gray values between red and blue or green and brown or whatever. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it for now. There's one more thing that, which is that yesterday, I think, a guy named Harvey Stearns, coincidentally, posted an article on photopxl.com on black and white in the digital age. I thought was rather appropriate. He explained a lot of this. I think in better terms than I have. So I will post a link to his article in the comments for this meetup, and you can access it from there. Again, if you have any questions, you can send me a message through the meetup, and or you can go to our website, which is www.wolfnl.com, and contact me through the website. And let me just hang on a second here. Bring this up so people can see it. https://www.wolfnl.com/ That's our website, Eminem's Musings. There's about 100 tutorials on there related to photography, a lot of them related to Lightroom. All of the previous VPMG webinars that I've done are on there as well, and there's a contact form on our page, so you can leave a note there, and or you can contact me through Meetup, and but that's it. Marcia's going to come and beat down the door, and I haven't had lunch yet, so I'm going to go and eat. And I bid you all a fine good evening. Thank you for coming. We had 28 people registered. I'm not sure how many showed up for the first one. I apologize for the mix-up. Um, the Streamlabs OBS is the streaming software that I'm using, and they're a bit finicky. So I'm glad that to the people who managed to follow me over here, and for anyone who didn't make it, the video will be available at the same link, and you can watch it then. So have a great evening, and that's about it. Bye now.